At 5:30 in the morning, the Cedar Grove fieldhouse belonged to no one, and that was exactly why an old man loved it. Before the buses, before the whistles, before the squeak of 40 pairs of sneakers, there was only the hush of an empty court and the soft, wet sound of a mop moving across hardwood in long, even strokes. Leonard Grady had made that sound 5 mornings a week for 47 years, and he had never once thought of it as small. He thought of it as the sound of a door being opened for whoever needed it next. Michael Jordan had forgotten that sound until the moment he heard it again. He had come back to Wilmington for reasons he could not quite name. The way people at a certain age drive past the houses they grew up in, and he had pulled into the cracked lot of the community fieldhouse on a slow Tuesday afternoon, expecting only to stand for a while in a place that had made him. He was 62 now. His knees told the weather before the radio did, but he still moved with the same deliberate calm, and when he pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the cool, dim air, 40 years folded shut like a book. The fieldhouse had never been anything special. One full court, one set of pull-out bleachers, a weight room the size of a large closet, and a smell that lived in the walls, floor polish and rubber, and the ghost of 1,000 practices. To the city, it was a line item. To a skinny teenager who had once been told he was not good enough, it had been the only room in the world that felt like it was on his side. He had not come looking for a person. He had come looking for a feeling. But there, near the far bleachers, an old man was pushing a dust mop, and there was something in the way he did it that stopped Michael cold. The man moved slowly, but he did not miss a single board. He worked with the grain of the wood, the way a person does when they have learned that a floor lasts longer if you respect it. His back was bent. His hair was white as the chalk lines on the court, and though Michael could not yet see his face, his hands knew the shape of him before his mind did. Michael crossed the floor and apologized for interrupting. The old man looked up and squinted and said the court was closed until the evening program, unless the visitor was here for one of the kids. Michael said no, that he used to train here a long time ago before the sun was up. The old man nodded and said a lot of folks came back, that a gym like this got into your blood and never quite left. And then Michael looked past the years, past the deep lines and the tired eyes, and found a face he had carried in some quiet corner of himself for 4 decades. He asked softly whether the man was Leonard Grady. The old man tilted his head and asked if they had met. Michael told him it was Mike Jordan. Leonard Grady went still. He set his mop carefully against the bleachers, as if even in shock he could not bring himself to let it fall, and he took one slow step closer. His eyes filled. He said it could not be little Mike, not here, not after all this time. Michael told him he was not so little anymore, and instead of taking the hand the old man offered, he folded him into an embrace, and Leonard felt as light as a bundle of kindling against his chest. When they stepped apart, Michael noticed the ring of keys clipped to the old man's belt loop, the way he had 100 mornings long ago. Most of the keys were dull steel, the ordinary keys of a building, but one of them was brass, worn soft and golden at the edges from decades of handling, older than all the rest. Michael did not think much of it then. He would think about it a great deal later. He asked how long Leonard had worked here now, and the old man said 47 years come next month. He asked how old that made him, if it was not rude to ask, and Leonard said with a flicker of pride that he had just turned 81. Michael could not keep the shock from his face. 81, and still on his feet from dawn to dusk, still bending to reach the corners no one else would notice. Leonard only shrugged and said he had nowhere better to be, and the floor still needed doing. And standing there, Michael let himself remember all of it. He remembered a boy who had been cut from a team and had come here to be alone with his failure. He remembered how Leonard had found him one night shooting free throws in the dark, unwilling to turn on the lights, because that would mean admitting he still cared. He remembered the old man crossing the floor, flipping on a single bank of lights, and saying that a boy who practiced in the dark was a boy who was going to be a problem for a lot of people someday. And he remembered, most of all, the morning Leonard had pressed a brass key into his hand and told him he could come in early and shoot as long as he wanted, so long as he locked up behind him. Michael asked if he remembered that key. Leonard's whole face changed. He reached down and unclipped the ring from his belt and turned the worn brass key so it caught the light. He said this was the very one, that he had cut a copy for the boy back then and kept the original on his own ring ever since. Through 3 changes of the locks, through a new door in the 90s, even though it had not opened anything in this building for close to 40 years. Michael asked why on earth he would carry a key that fit no lock, and the old man looked at him with a patience that had been earned over a lifetime, and said that a key is not always about a door. Sometimes it is about remembering that you once decided to trust somebody. He said every time his hand found that key in his pocket, he thought of all the kids he had let in before sunrise, and it reminded him why he kept coming back. Michael did not have words for that, so he asked the old man to dinner instead. Leonard seemed genuinely puzzled that a man like Michael would want to spend an evening with a janitor, and Michael put a hand on his thin shoulder and told him that right now there was no one on earth he would rather sit with. The old man agreed on the condition that they go somewhere plain, because his bones no longer forgave fancy chairs. While Leonard finished the hallways, Michael went out to his car and quietly rearranged his life. He cancelled a dinner. He pushed a flight. He sat with his hands on the wheel and understood that something had shifted in him that he did not yet fully grasp. Then he waited by the doors, and when the old man came out in a pressed shirt and khakis that hung loose on his frame, Michael helped him up into the SUV as gently as he would have helped his own father. They drove to a small diner called Nadine's Red Vinyl and a checkered floor and faded photographs of neighborhood teams tacked crookedly to the walls. Leonard's face lit up the moment he recognized it. A waitress came, saw who was sitting in her booth and forgot how to speak for a moment, and Michael only smiled and asked kindly for 2 menus and 2 of whatever milkshake the old man remembered best. Over the meal, Leonard talked, and Michael listened the way he had once listened for a coach's whistle, with his whole attention. Leonard talked about his wife, Ruth, and how they would reach 58 years married come the spring. He talked about 2 grown children who lived out west now, far enough that visits had become rare and costly, and grandchildren he saw mostly through a phone screen, and 2 great-grandchildren he had not yet held. He talked about how he had come to the fieldhouse in the late 70s after a factory closed, after a war he did not care to describe, thinking it would tide him over for a year or 2, and how he had stayed for half a century because he had fallen in love with the mornings and the kids, and the simple, honest weight of a job well done. Michael asked as gently as he could why a man of 81 was still working full days. The light in Leonard's face dimmed a little. He said retirement was for folks who could afford it. He said the city pension had never been much, and that Ruth's bills after her stroke had grown into something he did not like to say aloud. Then, the way proud people do, he turned the conversation back toward Michael and asked whether the boy he remembered had turned out to be a happy man. But Michael kept coming back to that night in the dark. He reminded Leonard that after being cut he had been ready to quit basketball entirely, that he had cleaned out his locker and rehearsed the words to tell his mother he was done. Leonard nodded slowly and said he remembered that he had heard the ball hitting the rim over and over in an unlit gym, and had known without looking whose it was. Michael asked if he remembered what he had said that night, and the old man admitted the exact words were gone, so Michael gave them back to him. He said Leonard had told him that the best players are often the ones who have to fight for their place, and then he had handed him the key. And Michael told him, plainly, that the key had mattered more than any trophy he would ever win, because it had been the first time an adult who owed him nothing had decided he was worth trusting. When the check came, Michael paid it before the old man could reach for his worn wallet, and then he asked if he could drive Leonard home. The old man gave directions to a neighborhood on the far edge of town, where the houses shrank and sagged a little more with each block, until they stopped at a modest single-story home with peeling paint, a split walkway, and a porch that leaned. Leonard said, with an apologetic smile, that it was not much to look at, but it was home. Inside, Michael met Ruth, who rolled out of the back of the house in a wheelchair, her silver hair pinned neatly, her eyes still sharp in a body that had begun to fail her. When she understood who her husband had brought home, she pressed a hand to her chest and said she had never expected to see such a thing. Michael crouched to take her hand and told her warmly that her husband had shaped his whole life, and as he sat with them, he began quietly to see the stains spreading across the ceiling where the roof let the rain in, the floors that dipped underfoot, a hallway too narrow for Ruth to turn her chair, a dining room converted into a bedroom, and beside the hospital bed, a thin mattress on the floor. Michael asked, as lightly as he could manage, whether Leonard slept there. The old man said it was only for now, that he could not fit safely in the hospital bed, and their old bed sat too high for Ruth, so he made do. And Michael kept his face calm while something in his chest pulled tight, because here was a man who had spent his life lifting others, sleeping on a floor so his wife could rest. Ruth, who missed nothing, said plainly that they managed, that the pension was small and the medical bills large, and that they did not take handouts. Michael heard the pride in it, the same pride that had kept the old man mopping floors decades past the age of rest, and he did not push. He simply asked her about her life, and she told him she had taught grade school for 30 years, that she had loved a garden once, before the stroke stole her legs, and the raised beds went to weeds. And on the side table Michael saw a scrapbook with a faded red cover, and when he opened it his throat closed, because inside, page after careful page, was his own life, cut from newspapers and pressed flat, and saved by a man who had followed him the way a father follows a son. He drove back to his hotel and did not sleep. He sat by the window over the quiet streets of the city that had raised him, and thought about how much of what he had become rested on the unnoticed decency of one old man. And he thought about all the others like Leonard, the people who unlock the buildings before dawn and lock them after dark, the ones who wipe up the spills and fix the broken hoops, and quietly buy a kid a pair of shoes and never say a word. He thought about how a school or a gym runs on the labour of people whose names are never on any banner, and how the world has a strange habit of paying its loudest members the most, and its most faithful the least. By morning something in him had hardened into a decision, and it was not a small one. He called a lawyer, and a business manager, and a contractor named Hector Alvarez, who was known for doing the impossible on a brutal schedule. When Hector heard the scope and the deadline, he laughed, and then he understood Michael meant it, and he said that for a man who had believed in a boy the way Leonard Grady had, he would move heaven and earth. The plan was simple and enormous. Rebuild the house from the studs out, so that Ruth could live with dignity instead of struggle. Pay off whatever they owed. Set up something lasting, so that neither of them would ever again lie awake doing arithmetic with their fears. And do all of it quietly, without cameras, the way the old man had done everything for everyone else. Getting the Gradys out of the house was the first puzzle. Michael solved it through the fieldhouse director, a woman named Ms. Abrams, who wept openly when she heard the plan and arranged a week of paid leave under the cover of a maintenance shutdown. Then Michael invited Leonard and Ruth to a week at an accessible house by the ocean, a place with wide doors and a ramp to the deck, and a view Ruth had not seen in years, calling it a small reunion for the people who had shaped his early life. They hesitated. The kindness was almost too much to accept, but on Friday morning an accessible van carried them east toward the water, and the moment they were gone, Cedar Grove Avenue filled with trucks. Hector had assembled nearly 40 workers in 3 shifts, and they did not stop. The failed roof came off in an afternoon. The narrow walls came down. The cramped bathroom was gutted and rebuilt wide, with a roll-in shower and a bench and rails within easy reach. The kitchen was torn out and set again with lowered counters and drawers that opened at the height of a seated woman. Old wiring was replaced, old pipes were pulled, and a gently sloped ramp was poured where the leaning steps had been. And then the neighbourhood arrived, because word travels fast on a street like that one. People came to the edge of the yard, and when they understood what was happening, they did not gawk and leave. They stayed. They brought sandwiches and paintbrushes and stories. A woman who ran a garden centre brought raised beds and soil because she remembered Ruth had loved to garden. A flooring company sent hardwood. Teenagers showed up after school to roll paint, and with each of them came a memory of Leonard. One man, grey at the temples now, said Leonard had stayed late every evening for a month to help him study in an empty classroom he was supposed to be cleaning, and that he would have failed out of school and out of his own life without it. A mother said Leonard had quietly bought her boy his first real pair of basketball shoes when the family had nothing, and had made her promise never to tell. An old neighbour said that when his wife was dying, Leonard had come every single morning for 3 years to help lift her from the bed, and had never once let himself be thanked. Michael stood at the edge of the yard in his plain grey hoodie, and took it all in, and each story settled into him and changed the shape of what he was doing. This was no longer only the paying of a private debt. It had become a reckoning with a truth the world keeps forgetting, that the people who hold everything together are almost always the ones nobody thinks to notice. A local news van came, drawn by the crowd. Michael walked over and asked politely and firmly that they hold the story until the family had seen their home, and that when they told it, they make it about Leonard and not about him. The reporter, moved, agreed. The days ran together. Michael slept little. He moved between the beach house, where he kept the Gradys happily distracted, and the job site, where a small miracle was taking shape board by board. He learned from Ruth that the doctors believed she might walk again with real therapy, but that insurance had covered only a handful of sessions, so he had a therapy room built into the spare bedroom and arranged for a therapist to come to the house. He learned their anniversary was near and had a treasured broken clock quietly repaired. He called their children, who sent photographs to be framed and small details that only family would know. On the last night, when the crew had gone and the paint had dried, Michael walked the finished house alone. In the bedroom stood one wide adjustable bed where the hospital bed and the floor mattress had been, so that a husband and wife could sleep side by side after 3 years apart. In the living room, a lit glass cabinet held Leonard's scrapbooks, the red one at the centre. On the wall of family photographs he had added a single new frame, a picture of a skinny teenager beside a younger Leonard in this very fieldhouse, both of them squinting into the same morning light. And on a small shelf by the front door he set an empty brass hook, though he did not yet let himself think too hard about why. On the 10th day at noon the van turned back onto Cedar Grove Avenue, and a quiet crowd waited behind a line of tape. Michael had asked them all to stay silent until the family understood. The van slowed, and through the glass he watched confusion cross the old man's face as he took in the transformed yard, the smooth walkway, the fresh blue paint Ruth had once said was her favourite colour, the ramp where the broken steps had stood. Leonard climbed out slowly and simply stood, unable to speak, and Ruth was lowered gently beside him. Michael stepped forward and told them that while they were away, some people who loved them had been busy, and that their home had needed a little work, so it had been taken care of. Leonard's voice broke as he asked whether Michael had done this, and Michael answered by placing a pair of scissors in the old man's shaking hands and asking him to do the honours. Leonard cut the ribbon. The door opened, and the two of them went inside, and the house they found was not the one they had left. Ruth rolled through doorways that had once trapped her, and turned in a full circle in the middle of her own kitchen and wept, saying over and over that she could reach everything, that she could reach everything. Leonard turned slowly in the living room, taking in the light and the space, and kept saying that it could not be real. Michael led them to the table where a folder waited. Inside was the deed, the mortgage gone, the house theirs free and clear. And there was more, he told them, a trust that would pay them a steady income for the rest of their days. Enough that Leonard could set down his mop that very afternoon, and every one of Ruth's medical needs covered from now on, without limits and without fear. Leonard sank into a chair and said it was too much. Michael crouched beside him and told him it was not nearly enough, not for a lifetime of what he had given. Then he gestured toward the window, where the crowd had gathered, and said those people were not there for a basketball player. They had come for him. And the door opened, and they came in one at a time, each carrying a story, and they spoke them aloud in that bright new room for the first time. Leonard sat and listened as 47 years of small, quiet kindness was finally said out loud and laid at his feet, and Ruth took his hand and told him softly that she had always known he was changing lives, and that now the whole street knew it too. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the evening had gone soft, Leonard found Michael on the new back patio and asked to speak with him. They sat on a bench beneath an old oak the crew had been careful to save. The old man said he did not know how to thank him. Michael told him he did not have to, that he was only returning a favour 40 years overdue. Leonard shook his head and said unlocking a gym door was a small thing. And Michael told him it was the least small thing anyone had ever done for him, because that open door had led to every court and every championship and every ordinary morning of the life he had built, and none of it might have happened without one man deciding a cut kid was worth a key. Then Michael reached into his pocket and took out something and set it in the old man's palm. It was the brass key, the copy, the one Leonard had cut for a teenager 4 decades ago. Michael had kept it all these years too, on a ring in a drawer, moving it from house to house without ever quite knowing why. He told Leonard that he had carried his half of that key across his whole life, the same way Leonard had carried the other. 2 men, 2 halves of one worn brass key, both of them holding on to the memory of a single morning when somebody chose to trust. The old man closed his hand around it and could not speak, and for a long while the 2 of them just sat there under the oak, and that was enough. There was one more thing to show them. Michael led the Gradys to a small back room that had once held boxes and opened the door onto a bright home office, a desk facing the garden, shelves along one wall, and above the desk a framed document. Leonard leaned close to read it, and his eyes went wide. It was the charter of the Leonard Grady Foundation, established to find and support the people who keep our schools and community centres running, the custodians and cafeteria workers and bus drivers and caretakers whose quiet labour shapes young lives, and who almost never hear a word of thanks. Its emblem, drawn in the corner, was a simple brass key. Leonard asked in a whisper why it carried his name. Michael told him he was the reason it existed, that his life had made everyone who worked on the house ask the same question: how many other Leonard Gradys were out there, unseen? The foundation, he said, would give scholarships and emergency help and public honour to exactly those people, and there was a position waiting if he wanted it, as its first director, so that the old man could spend his years lifting others the way he always had, only now in the open. Leonard protested that he was no good at speeches, that he had only ever swept floors. And Michael told him his whole life was the speech, that the foundation did not need another businessman. It needed someone who understood in his hands and his bones the worth of showing up every single day, doing honest work with pride, and caring about the people around you. That, he said, was Leonard Grady, and there was no one more qualified alive. Ruth, with tears on her face, told her husband to say yes, that this was his chance to turn a lifetime of small kindnesses into something that would outlast them both. And after a long silence, the old man nodded and said yes, and Ruth laughed through her tears that her husband had become a foundation director, and who on this earth would ever have guessed? Before Michael left, he hung the brass key on the empty hook by the front door, where the old man would see it every morning on his way out and every night on his way in. And he understood, more clearly than he had understood anything in years, that this was the truest victory of his life, and that it had nothing at all to do with basketball. Because here is the thing worth remembering, the thing that is easy to forget in a world that shouts. The people who matter most are seldom the loudest. They are the ones who arrive before the lights come on and stay after they go off. They are the custodians and the caretakers and the quiet mentors who decide, without applause, that the person in front of them is worth a little trust. Every child who ever became something was let in early by somebody. Every open door was unlocked by a hand that expected nothing in return. And the finest thing any of us can do, with whatever we are given, is to turn around, find the person who believed in us before anyone else did, and make sure, while there is still time, that they know it mattered, that they always did. So if there is someone who once opened a door for you, a teacher, a coach, a parent, a stranger with a key, do not wait for a perfect moment to tell them. Call them this week, say the words out loud. That is the whole point of a story like this one. If it moved you, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe, so more stories like it can find their way to you. And we would truly love to know where in the world you are listening from. So leave a comment below and tell us your city, and tell us who first believed in you. This story is a work of fiction. Mike Jordan is a real person, but every event, character, conversation, and situation in this narrative is entirely imaginary, created for storytelling and to explore dignity, grace under pressure, and quiet courage. Nothing here represents actual events or should be read as fact.